Hey, Chris.
Hey, we'll have to wait for everybody else.
Yeah.
Hello.
Howdy. Looks like we got a fairly decent gathering. We're a few minutes after. So, Chris, I think if you want to take it away and talk about Proposal F, I say go for it.
Yeah, so I thought I'd just start with an update. Yeah, we need to write this down in a proposal form. I think that what we're finding with the discussion is it's actually really useful. There's a bunch of things that need to be thought out properly, things like how do you index signatures and whatnot, which are not things we're tackling this with, it, like specifically on our side. So help in that area would be good. Justin said there's obvious problems with things like ints, so we need to use a digest or something, a digest of a public key or something like that to make sure it's unique, and you can't switch orders and things like that. But I think we now have enough to propose something. The only concern I'd have is the pushback by registries to say they don't want to make mutating manifest lists atomic. I feel like if you ask them pick between add new types and new APIs and fix the API that exists, they're going to choose the latter. They'll push back on doing anything, but like it's definitely less painful to make something atomic than to add a new API and DB.
Yeah, does anybody, we talked about the ETAG support in registries a long time ago, even like outside of the context of attaching and signing and whatever. Does anybody remember the sort of high level pushback on supporting that, or is it just like any change is impossible to motivate? Were there specific problems or just inertia?
The concern I remember, and I don't know the backing of this enough to give an authoritative answer on it, but they were saying that when you have an S3 backend to a registry, which a lot of registries do have that, that it is eventually consistent. And so an eventually consistent backend can't be used with an E tag because you just don't know the current value of it.
Mm.
S3 is now consistent.
Is it
it's not
consistent?
true
No,
anymore.
is that saying S3 from Amazon or S3 from any implementation?
From Amazon. But I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, again, if we can go back to them and say, fine, but then do you want to implement this API? And I guarantee they're going to go, we'd rather make this consistent.
Is it consistent by default, or like an opt-in to the bucket or an opt-in to the object or something like that? I mean, in any case, I totally agree with you. I'm just trying to get the
yes,
total shape of the argument.
Sylvain works at Docker onto the registry, but he'll know more. I think it's just by default, but
It's by default now.
Okay.
Let me pick it.
I think we could. I think the ETAG PR for distribution spec said should support ETAGs in the standard way or whatever, and not must or not, whatever, anything hard. I think it's a good practice in general, whether or not we specify it. It's a good practice, but we should specify it too.
Was there a PR in distribution for like fixing this racer? Like, because I haven't seen it. Maybe we can link it somewhere.
Yeah, I'll dig it up. There was a PR and distribution spec. I think John Johnson sent it to basically specify you should use E-tags in the normal HTTP semantics.
It's also a comment on the issue right now.
Yeah.
For
Josh has his hand up. Sorry, I keep interrupting.
And that would fix the race case or not? Or okay.
Yeah, so this is not about race conditions. If somebody wants to keep talking about race conditions, the one thing I want to talk about is the size of the attached artifacts. Is there, like this proposal, it's calling out to signatures. Is the idea that these are just small things? Like, could I attach a 5 megabyte cat picture?
That goes to the question we had also. I think that change actually also landed in distribution spec, that registries should enforce a size limit on manifests and clients should expect that size limits are enforced. I think for things like, I think it was even in the example, for things like SBOMs that might get very large, or things like attestations that might get very large, you can put that in a blob and reference it through a manifest to a blob, which is a bit clumsy, but it's there. I think the expectation is that it should be small data. If it's signatures, it's probably small data. If it gets large, I think the question then becomes, what if it's 100 really tiny things that together become big enough to cause problems, or 1,000 or 100,000 tiny things? But blobs is roughly the answer.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do here is find a trade-off, right? Like manifests lists or manifests are fetched. They should be relatively small. They fetch relatively frequently to check for updates. If you do a head against a manifest, you get a digest back, which tells you if some things have changed. And if you fetch the manifest, you don't want to fetch all the data in the world. You kind of want to fetch just enough to then make a decision and do something. I think signing falls into that bucket, because assuming you're using sane signing sized things, it should be okay. We're talking, we're talking bytes or kilobytes. We're not talking megabytes. Things like attestations, I mean, SBOMs and things like that can easily land up being 7 megabytes. So clearly that shouldn't be at the top level. I would agree that like having the OCI and people who run registries putting in place some limits would help. But I think as on the tooling side as well, we can say, what do we want the experience to be? What do we think should be? What is a reasonable size limit for various different things? And then to your question, Jason, do we see use cases where we'll have like thousands of signatures, or are we talking tens of signatures? Because yeah,
I don't think we will need to support a case where there are thousands of signatures. In that assumes you have 1,000, humans with access to the registry, which is not really normal either, and probably bad. I guess signatures are always very, very small. The problem is something that like SBOMs, which can grow over time, or 2 or 3 SBOMs might be enough to trip the limit. I don't know. But again, the answer in all of those cases is blobs. The answer is put it in a blob.
So if you were putting it in a blob and referencing it through a manifest, wouldn't that also increase the size of the manifest?
It would, but only by the amount of bytes it takes to have a descriptor. So you'd have to have many, many, many more objects to hit the limit. Yeah, let's assume for the sake of argument, it's 100 bytes, as opposed to, potentially megabytes of SBOM or attestation or whatever.
Okay, I don't see an issue where that would be growing too much.
No, it should be okay. And like the trade-off we're trying to make here, right, is if you put things in blobs in manifests, you need to fetch the manifest list, then fetch the manifest, then fetch the blob. So you do a bunch of round trips, which makes it a bit slower. So you don't want to do that too much if you can avoid it. But at the same time, then you also don't want to make the top level too big, because then if you put everything inside there, you have the whole image inside there, then you have to fetch the whole image to do anything. Brandon?
Yeah, I think the question comes down to what things are we attaching to our image? And if it's just a signature and an SBOM, then 200 bytes, let's say that number, no big deal. If it's that they're going to include the attestations for every single step of every single build that takes place, and then start including daily scan results and stuff like that, and that's going to, every single day you're going to add to it, there can be an issue. And the challenge is, I don't know how much we can control how users are going to use this after we release it.
There's also, like, for example, like if you do attestations today with cosign, then the way they're done is that there's a manifest only for the attestation objects. Like there's an image manifest, and every layer in there is a separate attestation. So, for example, layer in there is SBOM, and whatever, like your other like provenance attestation is the next layer there. So, like, I think this grouping logically also makes sense sometimes. So like this is also an option, right? But this is mostly for like the client side to define, like if they want to put like all the objects like separately into the root manifest as separate descriptors, or like they just define that there's one reference there that just says that I'm there like an attestation manifest, and then it has all those SBOMs and stuff like that inside there. And as a client, like you should just like pull in all the like. It either like understands the specific types, and it says that I'm only looking for SBOM, and then it just looks up the object that has the correct type. Or if it just says that I want all the attestations, then it just like gets all the objects that have a link to that blob that the client is looking for.
Sajay?
Hey, I had a couple of questions. I think we probably getting a proposal F is in written form would help. For example, what are the expectation of how the tags will look? Second one is, we did say that the artifact repo inside open containers is not a specification because it doesn't change anything inside image or in distribution. If we are leaning towards no change in distribution or image spec, then what value is this specific group bringing is what I would like to know. Is it just about a new form of using the index and a guidance? If that's where we land, we should probably call it out as there is no change to any of these that people want to do.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, right? We had been sort of impaneled to describe changes to distribution or image spec. And if we're not going to do that, what are we here for? I think if we decide to go the route of not changing distribution or image spec, I think we can still specify a description of changes when you do an attachment, or when you the format of the index that describes an image plus its signatures, or the format of the nested indexes if we go that route. Not defining new types or new API endpoints, but new ways to use the existing ones. The point of that specification is so that two people can independently write a client and a server that can talk to each other. So there's still value in having a specification for how a client should send its attestations and how a server should respond with its SBOMs or whatever. Does
Makes
that
sense.
yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then we should probably like look at proposal F and call out its limitations. For example, there's no limitation on the number of blobs you can put on a registry today. No limitation on the number of manifests. We have introduced limitations with the number of items in an index by virtue of its size, the number of scan results that can be attached. So I think it's a spec with a limitation by default compared to an open-ended implementation, because a lot of the conversations are moving just specific to signatures, and we missed the actual description of how do you attach SPOMs, how do you attach scan results, how do you attach cat pictures, whatever that is, right? So I think just looking at it from a higher order, that this is a recommendation given the current situation, but is it somewhere where we want to end up and land? Is the higher order question that I think I wanted to ask. And given that we don't have it written up, it's becoming a lot of specific details. But it also kind of clearly is leaning towards we don't need a spec repo, because last time I remember Samuel clearly called out that if there's no changes in any of this, it's just a recommendation. It's just as good as an annotation change or a config media type change. This, which is not, which doesn't require an actual specification per se. So maybe when we take it to the OCI body, we have to say this is a recommendation versus, and clients will agree upon this. Is the way we're going to formulate it also.
You should go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Sajay said. There are a lot of use cases that proposal F like addresses, but in a very like clunky way. There is like no filtering, and that was something that we had listed out in use cases. There's no way to even solve for the proliferation of tags if you wanted to create some kind of monotonically increasing way of tracking changes to a container image beyond name the tag something that is reasonable to whoever is using it. I guess I'm wondering if maybe to help this discussion further, we just need to look at proposal F and do the usual rubric of comparing it to all the other use cases and listing out why how it would address those use cases.
Yeah, I think all of that boils down to we should have a full proposal in the template form and go over it the way we have the other evaluations. I think we know that none of the proposals will satisfy all of the requirements. I think none of them have so far, and this one doesn't. And we can make a G and H and I, but eventually, like, we just have to say it meets 32 of the 35 requirements, and that's good enough. Sajay, to your question, to your point about focusing too much on signatures and not enough on the general attachment of a cat picture to my image case, that I think that's just like conversational hygiene. When we say signature, what we actually mean is anything, and that means small things and big things, and that's all we have to remember. Is sometimes they will be small and sometimes they will be big. I think we've done a pretty good job at that so far.
Most of us mean that, but I would just stress that the one difference in proposal F was that the signatures were the one thing that were treated differently, and I think we've been harping on that a little too much.
Oh yeah, I think I would like to not consider signatures special, but small things special. If in general, signatures are expected to be small, and so they can be attached in a more efficient way. We should come up with a placeholder example of a small thing, a kitten picture, as opposed to a whole full-blown cat picture. And use that as the example of a small thing that's attached that can be inlined for better fetching. There was also an example I wanted to mention because you reminded me there is an example in the comment thread. I think Justin said instead of using integers, using the hash of the public key or something, that is very signature specific. And that is not something that we can generalize to, well, you could say the hash of the kitten picture or whatever, but that's a place we should be careful to be, you know, conversationally hygienic when we talk about what the thing is. Yeah.
Okay, yes, we need to write it. I also need a lot more hours in the day. I'm going to get Sylvain to help me draft it out. The reason we've been focusing on those issues is because those are, in our minds, the hard ones. The how do I attach a kitten picture or whatever as a manifest or a blob, that's, at least for us, has been, you know, that's the area we think we have a good understanding of how to do it. So that's why we've been focusing on the corner cases where we think things are harder. I think the OCI shouldn't be super prescriptive of how to handle every single case. Their job is to focus on, this is the image spec, this is the distribution spec, and then tool builders should then consume that as it is and build things around that. I think requiring the OCI to define absolutely everything is the wrong thing here. I think we should find the minimum viable amounts for collaboration, and that's it. If we go too far, then all we do is kill creativity and kill the ecosystem. So it's about finding that balance. In general, I would say, so just on that, so when you talk about things like filtering or whatnot, I think we should find generic filtering solutions, not specific to this problem. So if your annotations or something like that is something you want to filter on, there should be like generic filtering for annotations rather than tackling this specific problem. And that can come out of this working group. I don't think the working group is useless because they haven't proposed a major change to the spec. I think that's actually a good thing if that is the conclusion. I think it should be, here's a recommendation for how things could be. This, people can rally around this. We think these 3 things should change or be written down somewhere, like annotations will be used for this. We want this API to be atomic and something else. Like that's completely okay, I think, and good. Sorry, Nisha.
Yeah, so how about this as a use case? So one of the things that I've been working on is creating SBOMs, what the community calls micro SBOMs, and then linking them together. So what would be useful in that scenario is to have that linkage somewhere in some manifest somehow. So that is a use case where you would want, like, that is a use case where you have a small object that's linking to another small object that's linking to another small object, and something else would consume those and aggregate them together and find answer questions about them or migrate them. And this is one of those situations where you would like to be able to, I suppose, for lack of a better word, build like trees with those links. So with regards to your question about whether we list all of those in the index or we append them, that's a use case for that would be more conducive for appending. And that's also a use case where the small thing is not a signature. Yeah, the small thing is not a signature. It's an SBOM, but it does not behave the same way as a signature does. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I'll go very quickly. I think the tool we have for trees is OCI indexes and nested OCI indexes. So we have the tools we need.
So just to like explain the description of this proposal a bit, maybe we should just go over it a bit so that everyone has understanding. But at the moment, what it is describing is how to attach blobs to a descriptor. And that's like the generic way of how you can define that this blob contains any data you want. So it can be in an SBOM. It may also be like a list of SBOMs if you have like multiple of them. And then at the moment, as in the current description, the signatures are like an optimization on top of that model. Like we could have as well just added signatures as additional blobs there, but we made like an additional optimization. So because like verifying a signature is kind of like a common process, and the object is small as well. Like we could do it so much faster if we would do something differently for signatures, and we will put it inside the annotation. Like if you look at the annotation keys in here, like in this case, they're like there's six or .cosine. Like it's very specific to signature, right? Like it's not really like proposing any model of how you can like inline your custom objects or custom data inside the annotations.
Yeah, and
so,
actually that doesn't allow you to account for new things that are coming up in the signing community. For example, TUF is working on a specification called DSSE. I mean, so it's easy to point to a blob. It's not really that easy to point to a data structure that is moving, like that's changing all the time, because especially in the SBOM world and in the signature world, you want to be able to leave old objects alone and update new objects that reference the old objects. So if you bundle it all together into one object, that object has to be, even if a component in that object changes, the whole object changes. That's what a DAG is. But I guess what we're looking for is I don't know what I am looking for. Maybe this is like completely not possible with registries, is there's some way of creating graphs. So I'm sorry, Brandon, I interrupted you.
A lot of what you're talking about reminds me a lot of GitBOM support, because that condenses it down to a single digest, and that digest can then be extracted out to a whole tree of data out there. And that also falls in a nice scenario similar to signatures, where it's a very small piece of data that you would attach, and so it would be likely to fall into that annotation category. So that might be another place to look at. I did have a little bit of a concern going back to a comment from Chris earlier, where they're saying, we shouldn't be prescriptive about how to do something. We should just say, here are the tools, and it's up to each individual user of those tools how they want to use them. The risk I worry about is that we get into interoperability issues when we get a little too loose with our definitions, because how one person implements it is going to be so different from how another person implements it, that anybody that's trying to implement pieces that are talking to each other are going to have a very difficult time making that connectivity there. So I'm just thinking of a couple of examples, like when BuildKit started pushing out the caches and was using an index in that case for representing blobs when everybody else assumed they were manifest. That was one issue for us to face dealing with that one. I've also seen a lot of cases where people start doing the OCI layouts, but different groups decide on what annotations they want to put within there, and not everybody puts an annotation. And so you can't all parse the same OCI layout from tools all over the place, because everybody's putting their own annotations in it. So there are a bunch of concerns like that I see. Chris, do you have a quick follow-up on that, or otherwise we should go to Josh?
Yeah, I'll go quickly. What I meant to say was we should have a minimum required to make sure things work together, because the like if you get too prescriptive, then it just lands up nothing ever happens, because you don't want to get everything perfect. But if we could just list, like, for example, the annotations in common and agree that this is the basic data structure, we're done, I think. That's what I meant.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that whatever we create, there's a very specific, here is how, when we push the signature up, what to look for when you see a signature out there, and know how to copy it across, and not being overly prescription on a signature, but any kind of annotation, how there's getting copied across when you're like setting up mirroring or something like that, or any other tooling out there. Josh, go ahead.
So how do I vocalize this? So I think one of the things that's great about this group is we're trying to get all the different registries together and like come to terms on something, even if it's not our favorite thing. And one of the things I don't like about this new proposal is that Jason made a comment that's like, I don't love this, and I don't think any of us do. And then Chris said, yes, I don't either. I don't love this either. And I know from last week or the week before, there was mention of, I think it was Justin has some pie in the sky registry idea. And the reason that we don't want to do what the working group was doing with proposal E is because it makes all these changes that are sort of intermediary, whereas this new thing could solve all those problems with like a graph model. Is there a possibility that like that could be another proposal, or is that written anywhere? Because like everyone's here to you know, like try to make changes to achieve these things, and I don't really want a stopgap. But at the same time, if everyone's going to agree on it, that's most important to me.
I think Justin wrote a gist or something at some point, but it's such a big change. It really requires, it would be like a multi-year thing. So I don't think realistically it's in the timeline that we'd want here. There's multiple, the registry specs were put together kind of ad hoc and built along, and Steve did really great work with what he did. But we've learned a lot since then, and things like backward compatibility is really difficult in the spec. That's one of the things that's really hard that we're trying to navigate. The data structures we have are not exactly perfect for all the different use cases we want. You actually probably want more of like a graph data structure, something like what Git has. That would be way better. But once you start going down that path, you see quite quickly that we get into a space of like, we're going to have to rethink like everything from data structures to all the APIs. And that's something I think the OCI should consider, but like it requires buy-in over multiple years from all the big providers. Oh, it looks like Nisha Myth. Oh, here we go. It might be that one. I don't remember. I wasn't in the OCI meetings where it was proposed. I think I took a quick look at it. So it's like, I don't think it's on the same level of this. This is something we could do in X months. That's something that could be done in 5 years.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is even anything here could take time to roll out. And so everyone's here at the table right now. And that's why I mean, does anyone else feel like a proposal of that size would be completely like that we shouldn't even go down that road?
I think it's a proposal we should consider, and if there is interest and sort of the intestinal fortitude to actually do it, then I think it's worth doing. I think we have to balance sort of pragmatically getting something out and idealistically getting the perfect thing out. I think the same sort of feedback was on Nisha's proposal on D. I think it was that it was like, this would be great. This is a graph-based model. This is like everything we want, but it's going to take years to get this approved, let alone rolled out and available in enough places that people can use it. I think we need to think both short-term, what can we do today with existing tools, or at least light modifications to existing tools, and super long-term about what we want the world to look like in 2030. 2030 is not even that long from now. 2050. So yeah, I want to do both. I mean, I think we need to do what we can with the tools we have, and also think about, don't say XML, not XML, JML, something new. Yeah, if folks here are interested in the really nailing down the pie in the sky future ideal perfect thing, I'm here for it, but I don't want it to distract from being able to do something in the near-ish term either.
I guess like the reason I say it is it sounds like anything that's not that, anything that, Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, any change to a spec in Docker's view is not, in the V2 version of the spec, is not a good thing.
I wouldn't put it that way. I'd say that it'll be, I would worry that it would take a very long time to roll out. I'd rather get something that goes out quicker and doesn't require a ton of consensus, because if you have to get me to update my personal registry at home, and then JFrog to update Artifactory, and Docker to update Hub, and Google to update GCR, and GitHub to update GitHub Container Registry, and Amazon and Microsoft, and the list gets really, really big and complicated really quickly, which means that the benefit to users is kind of pushed back until all of those happen. And especially if you start proposing fallbacks, like, I don't know, I assume most people here are part of product teams, but have you have you tried to convince a PM that it's a good idea to implement this thing when it already works? Like, they'll only do it when there's pain later, which means we can land up in this ecosystem where like half of the registry is implemented because some PM got convinced that it was a good idea to do. The other half won't, because it's just not a major use case for them. And the user experience is really crummy as a result of that. That's what I'm worried about. It's like the coordination problem of making an API or data structure change is non-trivial.
So here's where I'm a little worried, because there's a number of stakeholders in this meeting that all are representatives of fancy companies that have money to give people to go and implement like whatever a fancy architect wants them to do. So if a fancy architect looks at this and says, well, you know, I think we can do one better than this, and it's going to be awesome, and people are going to love it, they're going to go and throw money at it, and you know, have marketing teams behind it and all of those things. So my worry is that if there isn't any indication from like an open source group that says, look, we're anticipating that, you know, fancy architects are going to be wanting all these things, and we're not able to find a way to provide that to them in the near term. We're not talking about like 5 years, we're talking about like incremental changes that maybe will get to 5 years, or at least some way of allowing these fancy engineers to upstream their changes, then there's, I mean, I don't feel like there's any point in having an open source specification in the first place. I mean, that's the whole point of us being open source, is to be able to have something that everybody can use. So, I mean, I'm just worried that, you know, us not moving in that direction is going to stifle the work that everyone's doing here together.
If you got a quick response to that, Chris, go ahead.
I think it's not like either the OCI makes changes and companies adopt them, or open source is dead. I think it's like this is the place where a group of companies kind of come together and they say, these are our concerns, this is how we want to move things forwards, where do we want compatibility, where do we not, and then we iterate in that way. The intention here is not to I think the intention should not be that the OCI proposes stuff and then enforces it on people. I think it should be a case of like, we work together to find common ground and places where we build on top. So we can commoditize the boring bits, have compatibility across the boring bits, and add our value on top of it. It is a tricky balance to hit. And what I'm trying to do here is not squash the OCI, really. I think if we propose something that is easy for more companies to implement, there's a higher chance that more of them will do it, as opposed to like, there's definitely a continuum there. And it's not about big fancy companies. It turns out Docker is not one of these, by the way. We're the $1 billion company amongst the $1 trillion companies. So we are not the big company here. Even in the $1 trillion companies, though, they have the same problems everywhere. Like, there's always not enough engineers to do the things. There's always prioritization, and even things that may seem like good ideas to a small group like us have to be fed through their sausage machine of what's priority and what isn't, and all of that. So what I'm trying to look for here is really how do we solve the problem of all of us in a way that's lots of people adopt, so we get this everywhere, so we get our users happy. That's what I'm aiming for, and the OCI is the right place to have this discussion.
So a comment that I'd heard from Justin earlier, and I don't think I'll mind having it rephrased here, and I'm completely paraphrasing it, but some of his bigger vision for what registries would look like, his goal was much closer to what like a Git repo looks like today. And so he's got some visions on how it should look. And his concerns with what he was seeing from Proposal E was that if registries go down that path and create this stuff that can be extended after the fact without modifying the initial image, that kind of data structure isn't portable and couldn't be moved over to whatever new grand scheme he's thinking of. And so there was some concern about how to make a structure that if he's got this new big vision, that we can take the objects we have today and put it into that new structure.
And just so you know, jumping up on that grand scheme thing, I'm pretty sure that there are a number of people that also have other grand schemes, and those grand schemes do not have a common place to land in the specification. If there isn't any room for that. So I mean, like, for example, the Git model thing is actually a good example, because that's part of the reason why I was talking about, like, you know, how you would track change on a registry beyond just pulling from a mutable tag. And one way of doing that is to have some kind of data structure on top of the artifacts that exist that actually tracks changelog, or gives you an indication that, yes, we are changing, it's monotonically increasing, and this is the diff, this is the changelog, this is the source code that it came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you do not have some kind of management ability on in a register, like built into the registry, that would make somebody who does not have control over, say, or you know, does not have I guess like top-down authority like Justin has, to be able to go and say, okay, go and implement this.
Justin's proposal is not, no, he definitely doesn't have top-down power. I think people just respect Justin because he's a smart person, and he has an idea of a data model that would solve a lot of the problems we've seen. He's definitely not the OCI supreme dictator or anything like that. But I think these things are good to discuss.
I didn't mean it that way. I'm not saying,
yeah,
like, you know, okay, like, full disclosure, I'm an architect at an up-and-coming cloud provider, and I have grand visions as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why I'm here in this working group is to be able to figure out how this grand vision overlaps with what exists right now, and how to, like, you know, do the, as the saying goes, like, the big tides, what big wave pulls up boats or something like that. Rising tide lifts all boats. There we go. So, I mean, if there isn't a path, then this is difficult to do. And I guess I'm wondering, like, Chris, if you see a path that we could, you know, take, that would get us to that, like, grand plan thingy.
I think there's two things here. I think there's solving for specific use cases where we have commonality. So in this case, from what I got involved very late in this, so I'm also not the right person to answer all of these questions. But like, this working group, from what I understand, is to kind of solve a specific set of use cases where we've seen this. We need to reference different objects. We need to add metadata to images, and we don't know how to do that in a way that's detached from the underlying object, but still stored in a registry. So that's what I see this, like, meta working group's problem of solving is. I don't think this working group should dictate necessarily how signatures are done, although that is a good use case to test on, or how SBOMs are stored. I think those two things are kind of adjacent, but how to reference things and connect them up, it should. In terms of like the meta, how should data be structured inside registries in the future? I think that should go straight to the top of the OCI, and they should have that discussion there. And the way to get engaged there, I think, is to go to the OCI meetings and ask that question there. This like, I don't think it's. I mean, this working group could raise the complaints. For example, we can raise the things of like, we want OCI index editing to be atomic because it breaks our use case here. Like, I think that's a valid thing to raise up, but I don't think if we go to them and say, we would like to redo the entire registry architecture because it would solve our problems, that's a good approach, because it would solve our problem, but it wouldn't, it kind of goes much bigger than we need to solve our problem, I think. So I would take the bigger stuff to the OCI. It's like the, I don't know what's called, the TOB or TOC, and see what they say.
Yeah, we have a couple of OCI TOB people, including Josh and Nisha. I think to the question of like, how do you motivate people to let you innovate things? I think there are two proven ways with examples and one proven bad way with examples. One of the ways is to just go build the thing yourself in a vacuum, iterate on it, show that it works, show that it's good. And if it's good and people agree with you, then, you know, customers will beat a path to your door, and Docker will implement it in Hub, and Azure will implement it in ACR, and et cetera, et cetera. The example for that one is Docker Hub. They just invented the API one day, and it worked well enough that people used it, and then it got, you know, OCI-ified because other people wanted to use it. Like that is how innovation happens. Another way is to live inside the constraints of the system. Cosign did this. It allows you to attach signatures inside without requiring changes to registries. It's imperfect. Everyone kind of dislikes the warts, but it exists and works today, and doesn't require any change. So everyone has opted into supporting it just by virtue of running a registry. A one way that doesn't work is to sit in a room with a bunch of other smart people and come up with the ideal scenario and say, OCI says this is the way to run registry V2 or V3 or V5 or 6 or whatever. And then use that to say, you know, Google, you have to implement this API now, or Amazon, you have to implement this API now. Like, they just won't. They just, you know, especially if V1 works fine or V2, you know, the current existing OCI spec works fine, they're not going to do it without a reason to do it. So I would say, and you don't need OCI's permission to go write your own implementation of a graph-based registry or whatever you want. It just means you'll be doing a lot of work alone that might be rejected or bike shedded later by other people. But that's sort of just how it goes, right? Yeah, I think trying to convince OCI folks to accept this new API and then use it to, like, there's no way to use that as a crowbar to make other people do something. They just won't. I think that's true of the Justin's magical pie in the sky thing too. I think if he like built it and designed it and implemented it, he'd still need to go like convince everyone to go actually do it.
Yeah, the key piece is you have to get consensus and build consensus around ideas, and if you don't, then they don't succeed. And so it can be the best technical solution, but if you don't have users behind you and other people with you who can implement it, then it dies. It's a good and a bad thing, I guess, but it's just how it works.
So I do think we're pretty far off topic. Does anybody have anything they want to talk? Was there more sort of officially stated business about reference types? I'm more than happy to keep reminding folks that we need a proposal F, but I think they know. I think they know it. Otherwise, I think we'll just wait for that and talk about that next time or whenever.
I think outside of that, there's just been a little bit of iterating on proposal E, but nothing worth bringing up to the group, at least today. Unless Sajay and I want to talk about pointers for a little bit, but I don't think that's too interesting.
Who's supposed to write the PR, Chris?
It's us. I know. I was just trolling because I'm saying who needs to be reminded. It's us. It's I managed to get myself COVID, which is I do not recommend 1-star experience. And also I manage a lot of people, so I've got a lot going on. So I'm gonna get Sylvain to help me draft some of this and get it going forwards. I also found that the discussion on the issue was actually super helpful to kind of refine some of the use cases. So yeah.
If you need any help with that, I think this group would be happy to help out.
Yeah, I think we'll throw something together and then share it in the channel and get some feedback and then iterate on it that way. Hopefully we won't spend the next...
but I can tell you, just because I've submitted a proposal that was with no deep knowledge of any of this stuff, that it is like pretty straightforward to do. You don't have to put much research into it.
We will shred it to pieces, but hopefully politely. And so feel free to just throw something on the wall and see if the spaghetti sticks, I guess.
That's
Doesn't
what
have to
we
be
want.
perfect on the first. Doesn't have to be perfect on the first iteration. We'll go through the PR more than enough times for you.
That's what we want. As I said in the initial thing, like nobody's gonna, so to Josh's point, nobody's gonna be super stoked with it. But I think it's the, in the list of trade-offs we have to make, redesigning registries all the way down to find something that works. Hopefully we'll find something that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think it was Josh that said in there as well on the PR that, you can fill it out with a bunch of things that it's just like still figuring this part out. And we'll even approve it in that case, and
I think like it gets put up, we just merge it. I don't think we need to have the discussion, but I think we need a document to look at first. So it's less about, is it acceptable as a proposal? If it follows the template, put it in. That's my opinion. So
yeah, what you see from F up there right now is not what I originally submitted. It took a few cycles.
all right, shall we call it?
I think so. Give people a
Thank
couple minutes back. It's
you.
been a long weekend. Probably a whole lot of stuff to do when you get back.
Thanks, everyone. A good one.
Have a good
See
one.
ya.
Bye.